Hello there, my name is Gavin Walsh and today is the 3rd of September 2025. Quite a special day if you're into the Sex Pistols as we all were as teenagers. They were the biggest in thing. The oldest of the Pistols is Steve Jones and today is his 70th birthday. I mean, can you even begin to comprehend that? It shows how older we ourselves are getting even as fans. Um, Steve was really the backbone of the Pistols, and if you go to their their epic album, Nevermind, their debut and their epic album, Nevermind the Bollocks, Steve actually was the guitarist on practically all of it, including the bassist. Sid's input was quite minimal, to say the least, for lots of reasons. Steve Jones has since then been recognised as one of the world's greatest guitarists and has sessioned with many major artists, including Bob Dylan among many. And he has his own very successful radio show in Los Angeles this past, I believe, about 20 years. And I think, I'm nearly sure it's still on the go, but it pops up from time to time and it's very successful. And he is currently back playing with the Pistols, sans Johnny Rotten, of course. But he's become a very wealthy man in his own right, and who'd begrudge it to him, rightly so. I'm not so sure that he was involved in writing the stuff. If evidence suggests he wasn't, that Johnny Rotten was the main brain behind the Pistols and augmented with Glenn Matlock. But Steve was behind a lot of the music, and certainly was behind all of the lead guitar sessions and a lot of the bass. He came in and he did a lot of bass on behalf of Sid and what would have been Matlock tracks on the epic album Nevermind the Bollocks. And speaking of Nevermind the Bollocks, Steve actually came up with the phrase for it. He used to go to a stall somewhere in London, and this guy behind his soil, whatever they'd come up with in conversation, this guy said, never mind that bollocks, never mind that bollocks, and meaning the person was a bollocks. So when the initial album was set to be called God Save the Sex Pistols, Steve Jones vetoed it, and he said, no way, I wanted this catchphrase, never mind the bollocks. And that's literally how it came from. It's that innocent and that simplistic. And as we know, it was blocked, and Woolworths, the biggest record retailer in Britain at the time, wouldn't sell it, and etc. But it still smashed into the #1 album charts or smashed into the British National Album Charts at #1. The first to do so since the Beatles' first album did so 15 years earlier on advanced sales, and it's since become a multi-million seller all around the world and has been pressed in places as bizarre as Korea and Russia, believe it or not. But anyway, back to Steve and Steve's birthday. Thanks to a man called another fan who contacted me today online, Kevin Harris, who's a Pistols fan, and he brought it to my attention that it was Steve's birthday. I didn't even remember, to be quite honest about it. And I put up 2 posts on Kevin's page, and I'd like to tell you about them now. They're 2 factual occurrences of my life and my interaction with Steve Jones. First things first, the first question you'll always get asked is, did you meet Steve Jones? Well, the answer to that is a flat no. I never met Steve. But on the 8th of January 1995, which is over 30 years ago, it was a Sunday night, and I, at that point, was going on round the world record trips, and I would leave a flyer or a little business card with my name in all sorts of collectible record shops. Now, if you're not in the business, the collecting record shops are completely different to retail record shops. And I would go to these stores and leave a little business, a calling card and Pistols collectibles wanted and stuff. And in any event, at some point I did this in the city of Los Angeles and San Francisco and lots of other cities all around the world, Australia, New Zealand, even in the Far East, everywhere I would go. But we had a landline at the time, and I would instruct my mother, if anyone ever called, they could call from different time zones. I would often say, take a note and write down whatever. So this particular Sunday, I believe it was January the 8th, 1995, I was out with the Sunday night crew. We used to go out. That was when we could drink, and we'd go out the whole day Sunday. But anyway, with Shamey O'Boyle and the boys, God rest you, Shamey. But we were out that particular day and that night, and of course I came home that night half tanked and full as a tick. And the next day, my mother says to me, you had a call last night from a guy called Steve Jones. And I was a bit perplexed, and I said, are you sure? And she said, yeah, it was a guy called Steve Jones. And she said, when I pushed him on who he was, he just said that you'll know who it was. He said he was Steve Jones from Los Angeles. And my mother went on to say, but he had a Cockney accent. Well, that was the most bizarre thing ever. It turns out that he was selling a guitar at that time. Now, I did try and call it back, but for some reason I never connected. What a pity, because I would have bought that guitar. I had money back then, but anyway, can you imagine what it's worth today? But that's another story. Steve had a very troubled past. He was in a lot of reform schools, which are like teenage children prisons for thieving and all sorts of stuff. And at one point he came to an adult court, and he was on the cusp of being sentenced to prison because he'd expired all his lifelines. And Malcolm McLaren went in and gave the judge a guarantee that he would take him under his care, and he did. And the Sex Pistols came out of all of that. Isn't that amazing? But Paul Cook was his best buddy, and Paul was an electrician's mate. Paul was the quieter of the two, and they used to hang around in Malcolm's shop, which was appropriately called Sex. And at that time, Malcolm McLaren, then there was no name Sex Pistols, but the band were often out and trying to rehearse, and Steve Jones would steal the gear from David Bowie, believe it or not, in places like that. And Malcolm McLaren at one point went over to New York City to manage what I would regard as one of the world's first true punk rock bands, or a glam rock band, I should really call them. They were called the New York Dolls, David Johansen, and they were really ahead of their time. And in the early 70s, in 1975, the summer of 75, McLaren went to manage them. And when in New York City, he heard of a street gang, which is just a teenage street gang called the Sex Pistols. And you can see what happened. He stole the name of them, he got rid of the Dolls, and he came back and he got these kids who were hanging around his shop, which was Steve Jones, Paul Cook, Malcolm McLaren, Steve Jones, Paul Cook, John Lydon, or Johnny Rotten, and Glenn Matlock, and he formed them as the Sex Pistols. And they had their first gig in November 75, 50 years ago in 2 months' time, and the rest is history. And a lot of that I detailed in the first of my books. In the introductory pages, you'll get it. So that was Steve. That was my first interaction with, or shall we say, third degree interaction with Steve. Now let's roll on from 1995 to 2004. Our own Tabby here, our own Sligo Tabby here, was involved in the X Factor, and it was very euphoric at that time. And I went over for a week to him, and he was under the guidance of a guy called Mark Hudson, who himself was a fairly bigwig. He was an American rock producer, and he also was, I guess he liaised under Sharon Osbourne at the time of the X Factor. So Tabby brought me along to Abbey Road Studios, and at that time Tabby was a sessionist on Ozzy Osbourne's soon-to-be released Undercover album, and indeed is credited on same. But anyway, so we were in the studio this entire day, and everything was hype. It was great buzz of an experience. You were up there with the big boys, you know. Tabby had been there a few weeks at this stage, so became second to him. I was totally amazed by it, obviously. And the next thing Tabby says to me when he comes out of the studio, comes out of the recording and takes off all the stuff off, and he says, "You need to come back in here," he said, "and meet this guy, Mark Hudson." I said, "Any reason?" "Yeah," he said, "come in and listen to this." So I'm into Mark Hudson and with Tabby, and Mark Hudson says, "I understand you've written a book on the Pistols." And I said, yeah, and you're the collector, a big collector at the time. And I said, yeah. And he said, he's a personal friend of mine, and I go to AA meetings with him every Monday in Los Angeles. And I believe this was like coming up at the weekend, and he was going home that weekend. And I said, "You got to be kidding me." He says, No. He said, get me one of your books and I'll give it to him. So we were in London, so I went out somewhere and I bought the book. The book was on the shelves at that time. That's the book, by the way, God Save the Sex Pistols. And so off he went about his business, and sure enough, about 3 weeks later, he was back in London and I was back over with Tabby. And I couldn't wait to hear what he had to say. And he said to me, "I gave your book to Steve," he says, when I was going to the AA meeting, and he said, "I didn't get a chance to tell him what it was about." He said, the minute he handed it to him, he said to him, "Is this the Irish guy that knows more about us than we know about ourselves?" So that was a bit of a pat in the back after collecting them for what was probably 25 years at that point. And this is all 21 years ago, believe it or not. I believe it was November 2004. And of course, Tabby did appear on that album, and it was released, I believe, the following year. Anyway, so that was my interaction with Steve Jones. Now, as well as Steve Jones' very troubled past, which I've briefly detailed for you, Steve also was an alcoholic and a drug addict. And even after the Pistols, when he came into money, he was a heroin addict. And thankfully, sometime in the 1990s, he got off everything, and hence how he met Mark Hudson. And where a lot of these guys ended up. And you can see these people come to a crossroads at some point, and those with a bit of savvy and a bit of cop on or intelligence or insight or whatever the word is, they tend to get help and they get off everything. And to my knowledge, Steve Jones is completely a teetotaler right now, and a great guy. And just like to say happy birthday, Steve. And I know you can't take a drink tonight, but I'm going out to have a few for your 70th, okay? Cheers.